Welcome everyone, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Vicky St. Clair, and today's webcast is Design Thinking for Government Designers and Leaders, and it's sponsored by Aquent Federal in partnership with cBrain. And cBrain, of course, was co-founded by our guest speaker, Greg Godbout. You'll hear more about that, I'm sure, as we go on. A couple of quick points before we get started. We aim to keep this under 60 minutes today, but if you do have to leave, we will post the video within 24 hours. So you can find all of our webcasts on the Aquent Federal channel on YouTube. And we do have a chat box, so please feel free to jump in and ask questions. The more you participate with us, the more you'll take away. And we'll also leave a little time for an open Q&A at the end of Greg's presentation. So I'll make sure we get your questions answered before we leave. We are on Twitter. The addresses and a couple of hashtags here. If you'd like to share thoughts, ideas, comments, please do. And I guess that's it. We'll jump straight on in today because we've got a lot of information to share with you. Our guest speaker, of course, is Greg Godbout. He's the CEO and co-founder of cBrain North America. And if his name's familiar to you, it probably is. He's a former Presidential Innovation Fellow. He's the co-founder and executive director of 18 and CTO and US Digital Service Lead of EPA. So he made a significant impact during his government service. And as I mentioned earlier, he left government to co-found cBrain, which has worked extensively with the Danish government. It's now an international company. And I know he's going to share more about that with you. So let's bring Greg in here. Greg Godbout, welcome. We're so pleased to have you with us today, Greg. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And Vicky, this was my fault. It was a little oversight. I was actually co-founder and first executive director of 18F. So that was, I missed that on that slide. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. All right, so go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about well, we're going to get into design thinking, really how important it is for successful delivery within government. But as we're doing this, I want to keep these 4 agenda items sort of in mind, that we're going to learn how to embrace and apply the cone of uncertainty, identify the key benefits of moving from Waterfall to Agile, and understand why maximizing customer value is not the same as minimizing waste. In fact, I want to spend a good amount of time on this and why it's critical to measure both. And then also pinpoint the key connection between the North Star and design thinking. If we cover those 4 things, it will have been a successful talk. And what I'm going to try to do is keep this to about 30 minutes of me doing the presentation and then open it up, and hopefully a bunch of people have questions, and I'm happy to answer anything. So thank you for joining us, and go ahead and move the slide forward. Okay, so I want to start here at the cone of uncertainty because this is sort of also where my career in government starts as well. So just a little bit of my background. As was mentioned before, I own 2 theaters now in the DC area. One's called the Arlington Cinema and Draft House, which does movies and live comedy, and another one does, which we call Draft House Comedy, is a art black box theater in downtown DC. But I also have about 18 years of software development experience. And a number of years back, I found myself doing a small contract with a company that was doing government work, and I was actually building like a 3D immersive game for them for training. And they wanted me to build an enterprise, a new line of business for them. And I said to the owner of the company that I really didn't want to do a bunch of government work, because every time I worked with government before, there was never a huge demand by the customer for high quality, world-class products, and that I didn't want to get in the habit of building things that, didn't deliver on the full potential value. And he said, no, come work for us. We'll insist on it. It'll be great. And I worked for them for a few years, and about 2 years in, I'm working with a government client, and they said to me, we're in the midst, we're all sitting around a table, and I'm saying that, look, in order for a government user to finish their process, they're going to end up having to log in to 3 different systems 10 different times to do the average task, and that we've got to do better than that. We can't allow, that's just ridiculously slow. And the government client at the time said, Greg, don't worry about it. We're government workers. we're used to bad systems. So I want to kick this off with that discussion, because it was from that point forward that I just thought, we can't keep doing this. We have to have, in order for us to have world-class government services, we have to have world-class government systems and tools and things like that. And that's going to get into design thinking and things like that. And I guess briefly with my background, from there, I became a Presidential Innovation Fellow. I went to GSA, Government General Services Administration, and I worked as a fellow for 6 months in innovation around acquisitions. And specifically, I was looking at how to do agile acquisitions and make the acquisition process model how people work. And then that led to me setting up a group called 18F with a number of people. And then that led to me becoming the Chief Technology Officer of EPA, in which I started doing enterprise change at the executive level and transformation of a whole agency around moving towards agile, lean, and design thinking methodologies. And then ultimately led me to cBrain, which was a little bit of a strange leap for people because cBrain is out of Denmark. But what was interesting about Denmark, I was familiar with the UK model of what they were doing in digitization. But in Denmark, they sort of lead the Western world in digitization. 80% of their transactions with citizens are 100% digital. In fact, if they have a digital service, it's illegal for the citizen to send paper in. 100% of their transactions with government and business is digital. And I wanted to sort of immerse myself in that and see what was similar, what wasn't. And there's plenty of differences and plenty of things that are similar, but where do my learning lessons from what I've done in the US apply to this, and how can we come up with a better model? And that better model I'll be talking about today, and it's very practical and model. You'll find that I have a lot of delivery focus on practical things, but it all starts with the cone of uncertainty. And this is sort of the why we all find stress in government and things like that. And so if you're not familiar with the cone of uncertainty, this is a series of studies that were done, and they pretty much get the same results each time. And what they did is, many years ago, they took projects, usually projects that were run in a waterfall sense, but any like large project, usually about $10 million or more. And they measured, afterwards, they did a project retrospective, and they said, on day one of the project, what was your estimate of how much the project would cost and how much time it would take to deliver? So on the vertical axis, you see the estimates, and on the horizontal axis, you see time. And what you find is what you might expect is, over time, the teams that are building these projects out become increasingly more precise and exact as to estimating how much more effort it's going to take. What this also means is that it's statistically improbable, even almost impossible, for large projects to be predicted up front, because it's of the wild variety in estimates and things. The other thing that happened with cone of uncertainty that's worth mentioning is, generally, whenever they do this study, it's almost always between 25 and 30% of the total time in. Now, remember, you don't know starting how much time it's actually going to take, but they do know retrospectively about 25 to 30% of the time in, the teams become very good at estimating. And that's because we've brought down the uncertainty. And I'll refer to that later, because it's an important point on how to strategically go about delivering things. But if we live in this world of cone of uncertainty, and you look at government, for the most part, government enters into a contract on day one when uncertainty is at its highest. And all of us can imagine, if you're entering into a contract where uncertainty and risk is at its highest, what's the price of that contract going to be for government? It's going to be outrageous. It's going to be huge. What we really need to be doing is thinking of it as phases, and that's what I'm going to get into. And we really need to be contracting differently for each of the different phases. But it really is, you should not be spending most of your money up front. You should be spending that money up front, little bits of it, to test the uncertainty. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, I think, on the next slide, if we can move to the next slide. Thank you, Vicki. And we're going to get into lean methodologies. So, in this world of uncertainty, lean methodologies, which I'm going to way oversimplify here with a comment that just says maximizing customer value while minimizing waste. In a second, I'm going to get into like lean startup versus lean thinking, which are two different books. But lean is really a manufacturing process that was a way to sort of a guide on how to build something out. And it was popularized by Toyota many decades ago. And it was really the rise of Toyota was them doing this lean thinking, which is this title of this book. And a good example of this is Toyota was building cars, obviously, and they had manufacturing plants all over the world, mostly in Japan, but all over the world. And they decided one day they looked at everything and they said, well, what about the ashtray? How much value does the ashtray have? And so they did a design thinking exercise with the customers. They brought them into the room and they asked them about their ashtrays. Now you can imagine the answers in this question. I mean, some of the answers were like, people were like, I have an ashtray, right? And other people were like, I guess I need an ashtray because cars always come with them. But they realized there wasn't a ton of value to the ashtray because smoking in vehicles was going down dramatically. Second, the real question they were trying to get to is what color is your ashtray? And nobody could tell them what color they painted the ashtray. Yet Toyota, across all their manufacturing plants, was spending like $10 million a year. I don't know the exact number, but it was millions and millions of dollars painting ashtrays because they thought the customer thought they should be black. And instead, what happened is the ashtrays would be delivered to the manufacturing plant. They'd be silver. And then each manufacturing plant had a little stand, and there'd be a person there that would paint them black, and they'd move forward. And so Toyota was measuring through the customers, defining what value was to them, that this was insignificant. The color of the ashtray didn't matter. So let's take it out and save $10 million. Now, Toyota going up against the big, dealership, the big automakers in the U.S., the automakers in the U.S. weren't doing this. They were painting their ashtrays and leaving them in because that's just what they had done before. And Toyota, it was methodologies, really simple methodologies like that across 100 different items in the car that they were able to retain high value in the car, but minimize waste on the things that didn't have high value. And so it's really key here. Lean methodologies is maximizing customer value while minimizing waste. Now, when I was at EPA, I was brought in to get a lot of projects started, and we were focusing on lean methodologies. And I went around and I spoke to a bunch of different programs, and I sat down with a program and they said to me, Greg, you don't have to teach me about lean. We're lean. We practice it every day. And I said, well, that's great. I'm glad we don't have to, we can just, execute. I said, well, tell me what is your process and how long does it take? And they couldn't tell me. And they couldn't tell me any metrics about it. So I knew there was something wrong, right? If you didn't know the metrics of your process and you didn't know how long your process took, and they couldn't really tell me the value of their process and what it really delivered, I said, well, what does lean mean to you? And specifically at EPA, they were looking at lean thinking, and in this case, Six Sigma, if people are familiar with it. And it was a very specific practice that they were trying to teach everybody to use. And this person says, oh, my budget has been cut every year for the last 5 years. So we're lean because we're just cutting our budget. And I want to bring that story up because it's kind of humorous, but it's not true. Okay, so that is not lean. You do not in lean practices. It isn't about minimizing waste. Okay, that's second. You only minimize waste on the things that don't have value. In lean practices, you have to also measure value, and this is where I'm going to get to a lot, particularly in tying it to design thinking, because design thinking is really how you measure value in your customer's eyes or your citizen's eyes and your user's eyes. It's what value does government services have to me as a citizen? And if you don't know that and understand that, and you're on the other side of that, and you're just trying to cut waste, you're actually probably doing more harm to that value proposition than you realize. So I want to get to the whole metric of measuring both value and waste before we start making decisions. Can we go to the next slide?
There we go. I have a little time delay here, so I'm not sleeping on the job, Greg.
No worries, no worries. That was fast. That one was that. So this is Lean versus Lean Startup. So there's 2 books out, and that I think are really worth reading. The Lean Thinking book was the classic story of Toyota, and it really deals with it's maximizing value and minimizing waste in an existing system. In the case of Toyota, they already had manufacturing plants. They weren't building necessarily new ones, right? They had a model for how to build a manufacturing plant. They just wanted to do continuous improvement. on those, okay? In the case of lean startup, it uses the same basic methodologies and the same practices, but it's really for starting new or a major pivot. Lean Startup is a book that came out many years later, and it was out of Silicon Valley, and it really nailed, like, how can you define value and measure efficiency when you're starting something new? And this is important because if you find yourself in government that a program that you're part of or a project that you're part of just doesn't seem to get kickstarted. It seems there's a lot of meetings, there's a lot of discussions, but we're not going anywhere with it. It's likely because you need to start using some of the lean startup methodologies, that they really are great about getting started right away and going. That's true for Toyota as well, but when, if you're on a new project, the Toyota methodology sort of falls short because it doesn't give you that how to get started new. If you want to go to the next slide. And so now I'm going to apply this to the cone of uncertainty, okay? And so here you have two books that do an amazing job at a executive and business level, right, an operations level of describing best practices and how you should organize yourself and how you should work, but when should you apply them? And it's really, if you look at the cone of uncertainty, it gives you that answer. Now, this isn't drawn to scale, but it's essentially up until the team is able to predict with accuracy what the system or the program needs, right? Up until that moment, they should be using lean startup methodologies, because lean startup methodologies are great at figuring out what kind of product, what kind of program, what kind of service are you building, and where's the value proposition. And then once that becomes more predictable, you can switch into the best practices that are in the lean thinking book. In the case of government, when you think of contracts, acquisitions, you want to try to do time and materials when you're in the early stages, right? Because you don't know what you want, so don't lock in on requirements early. Later on, you can lock in requirements because you can predict what you want, and that's when you want to do firm fixed price from a government perspective. In the early stages, you're doing pilots, alpha, betas, things like that. And later on, you're in full production mode, and you're really doing continuous improvement. And so this just gives you an idea of when to use both of those. Can we move to the next slide? Back to slides, I think. One more. There you go. Awesome. So lean and agile versus waterfall. So this is going to go, now I'm going to go a layer deep. If you're using like lean startup and lean thinking practices at sort of an executive level or a program level, now let's get to the delivery on how our program is going to, deliver something. And so lean versus waterfall, I think this title of this slide's a little bit off, but I'm a big believer in lean and agile, and you're going to always hear me talking about lean and agile. It doesn't mean there's not a place for waterfall, okay? Waterfall is not great for delivering of services or complex products, but waterfall is pretty great at delivering commoditized products and even commoditized services. So there are times to use waterfall and there's times to use lean and agile. But in general, with the pendulum swing we were trying to do in government was to get people into more lean and agile practices. And so we broke it down into three different phases, if you will. One is discovery, the second is development, the third is continuous improvement. In discovery, the job is to embrace uncertainty. You want to invest in small short-term experiments. The goal here is to bring down uncertainty, because if you actually want to bring down the price of delivery of your service or product, if you look at that cone of uncertainty, you have to bring down the uncertainty first. And the most important thing here is make small investments, embrace uncertainty, which means don't go for low-hanging fruit. Nearly every program and people and product managers I talk to in government, all of them have been focused on let's go for low-hanging fruit to show a win. You got to be really careful there because you're not bringing down the uncertainty. You're really elongating how expensive your program is going to cost you, because eventually there's going to be uncertainty in what you're delivering, and you're going to need to see that. The next phase is development. This is after you come out of discovery, you discover in lean startup what they call an MVP, a minimum viable product. This is basically just a product that you think has viability. You want to put it in pilot mode, in production mode, to test that viability with real customers and real users so you can get that instant feedback. And to do that, you need a surge in development. So here's where you want to spend money. You think you've found value spend some money to prove that value. If you continue to improve it, spend more money to get the product into a more production state to where it becomes more predictable, and you go into continuous improvement where you're maximizing value and minimizing waste. And it's in continuous improvement that you really start to pull things out that don't add value because you've already proven the value. Now you want to start reducing the cost. So products and programs should cost less each year as you're following continuous improvement methodologies. Can we go to the next slide? And then this applies this back to the cone of uncertainty in the same graph. You see use discovery and development modes of delivery while in the lean startup mode, and then while in lean thinking, you have continuous improvement. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit into lean and agile, because this area of delivery becomes, it's a very sensitive topic, because most people in government is designed with waterfall methodologies. It's the way they do budgets, the way they do acquisitions, the way they do their financing, the way they do nearly every decision throughout the enterprise, and all the CXOs are all working with processes that are based off of a waterfall methodology that was the going popular methodology in the late 90s before Agile came in the early 2000s. And there's a great quote by this guy, Clay Shirky. He says, and it's very true, that the waterfall methodology amounts to a pledge by all parties not to learn anything while doing the actual work. Because in waterfall, you have to pick all of your requirements up front, design it perfectly up front, and the whole project is delivering on those requirements. And if anyone's ever built a house, or you're working in software, you're working in government, and you've seen a waterfall project, you know that changes to the system become very painful in those projects, and they're typically called change orders. I was a couple years ago, I was in Key West. They had a very expensive marina there that I was walking around. There was a very large boat, and the name of the boat was called Change Order. And you can tell the owner of that boat made their money with change orders. And that's important to think about from a government perspective, because in government, the strategy is government years ago started asking people to be agile, but really what happened is they were delivering waterfall contracts. And the promise to be agile was, well, we'll just do change orders every time we think we need to change something. And this hybrid model doesn't really exist. You can't be waterfall and agile at the same time, because what ends up happening is your costs skyrocket. You end up having to deliver on all the waterfall things because that's what's contracted. But in addition, you have very expensive change orders that come through. In fact, a lot of companies caught on to this, and their business strategy became to buy the business. They would go in and underbid, knowing they couldn't deliver on the system for that price, but it didn't matter. They knew that it was statistically impossible that government knew exactly what it wanted, and that would be learned along the way, and they would make the difference up at the change order, because at that point government was locked into that one vendor and didn't have a choice. And so this became an actual business model and a business strategy for companies to sell into government. The key here is, if you embrace the change, if you embrace the uncertainty, you would never use waterfall methodologies. Instead, you would use contracts and methodologies and things that align with Agile and Lean. And that's why we need to make this wholesale change. And it is unfortunately not an iterative change. You can't iterate your way from Agile to water, or from waterfall to Agile. You have to make a leap. It's a wide scale change. And I'm happy to get into those details and questions if people are interested. But can we go to the next slide? And so I bring this slide into it. It's the 4 stages of competence. I forgot the credit on this. Noel Birch was a psychologist doing studies of competence back in the, I think this was the 70s, might have been the 80s, but he has this study that was done about the 4 stages of competence that has survived time, has been referenced many times, and we all really live this, and we're all, at any single time, we are all have this in our lives. So we are, the lower stage you see is unconscious incompetence. Now that sounds harsh. Really what that means is you don't know what you don't know. Okay, so I don't know what I don't know. The next stage up is I know what I don't know, which is conscious incompetence. And then you get to I apply what I know, which is conscious competence. And then the next level up is I apply what I know without thinking, and this is unconscious competence. So I'm going to describe both ends to this because it's important. if government has been delivering with waterfall methodologies and not measuring using design thinking and not measuring value of what the customer wants, and they've been doing this for decades, it's inconceivable to think that there's people that are in government or shortly been working around in government that have the experience to work in the Agile methodologies and to do that differently. And it's not a confrontational thing to say because it's natural. All of us are unconsciously incompetent at something in our life, and then at some point we learn it. So the story I like to tell here is my mom. So I pick on my mom with this one. She is a terrible singer. She's not a very good singer at all, and she hasn't been her whole life. And when she was younger, around junior high, she went to join the church choir. And her parents were very supportive and said, honey, we think that's a great idea. And she joins the choir, and during the practices, the choir coach would look over to the right side near where my mom was amassed around other people and say, there is something going on here. This is not right. Like, let's stop. Let's start over. And she kept doing that. And eventually my mom started to get a little self-conscious and think, maybe she can't carry a tune. So she started mouthing the words. And right when she started mouthing it, the choir director was like, you guys got it. That's perfect. Keep going in that direction. And the reason I tell that story is at that point in time, my mom was unconsciously incompetent. And she didn't know she couldn't sing. And it was the moment in her life she realized that she was tone deaf. She couldn't sing. And it was hard for her because here her parents had encouraged her. So she goes home that night and she says, did you guys know I can't sing? And they said, oh, honey, we knew that. And they said, well, why did you encourage me going in there? They go, oh, we didn't want to disappoint you. And so, here we all go through this in life. This is a common thing. There's nobody in their life who hasn't been unconsciously incompetent about something. And we kind of look to our friends and family and close confidence to let us know when that's the case. But more often than not, people don't. So when we come up with services in government and we want to do design thinking and we want to set and use Agile methodologies to get ourselves there, we have to think about this, that we have to have coaching in place to help people get from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, and doing in an understanding way, because we all have to take that journey. Now, how do you find that coach? Then let's go to the opposite side of the spectrum. I was part of what they call the digital services movement. We were presidential innovation fellows. We were coming into government. And one of the mistakes that the White House and everybody made was this early messaging. They kept saying, well, we're bringing experts in and they're going to come save government. It was all this like offensive terminology that really wasn't reality. We came into government to learn from people in government. And when I was at 18F, all of the innovations we did, we were taught by an innovator in government how to do that. And that's what innovation is. It's borrowing upon the experiences of both sides and delivering on that. But what happened was, because of that messaging, there were a lot of people that came into government who were really talented. And to use a football analogy, I would say these are people that are like Peyton Manning of quarterbacks, if that makes sense. They're so unconsciously competent that they can't really explain to you why they're so good at it. They're just naturally good at it. And they've done it so much, it's become unconscious. And the problem with that is they actually can't walk someone through why or how to be good at it. It's actually that step before it, the conscious competence, the people who apply what they know. It's that group that makes the best coaches. So what I'm saying here is, I don't think Peyton Manning would make a very good quarterbacks coach. I think a coach that has applied all the best practices and rose up in their career and did very well, but understood exactly what they're applying, would make the best coach. And so as we talk about a culture and making these changes and this leap from these lean and agile methodologies to waterfall methodologies, I think it's very important to talk about the types of people we want to bring in to encourage that. And these are these coach types that can help people make this transition. So I hope this is making sense. We'll get into questions people have it. Can I see the next slide? Because I want to dwell in a little bit on design thinking. Good. Okay. So where does design thinking fit into all of this? I had a number of projects that there was not a single project that I either did a turnaround on, which was like an intervention where we did a turnaround, something was going wrong, or just a project that I was involved with that we were taking over because somebody had asked for help. It wasn't distressed. It was just going a different direction. I've yet to run into a single project in government where they weren't following the wrong North Star. So what I mean by that is too many double negatives in that sentence. What I mean is they were following the wrong North Star. And they couldn't define what the value proposition of the system they were building was. And when you don't have that definition down, doing Agile and Lean isn't going to help you. You need a way to define the value proposition. And this isn't out of Wikipedia, and I find it a refreshing, definition of a value proposition. A value proposition is a promise of value to be delivered and acknowledged, and a belief from the customer that the value will be delivered in experience. And the key there is a belief from the customer. And I want to think about government and the citizens, and where we are in this country in the sense of whether citizens believe government is going to deliver on their services. And overwhelmingly, that's a no right now. And I think it's unfair in most cases, but that's what we're experiencing. When I went to Denmark to study their thing, they have world-class services coming out of their government public sector, and they have people trust in the areas that they're getting it wrong. The people trust and believe government's going to get it right because, well, they'll just get there. In fact, that's what a cab driver told me, which was interesting. And so the key here is, if we're not, how do we find out what the value proposition is? When I went to EPA and I've talked to executives across government at different agencies, very rarely can one of them tell me what the value proposition of their program is. And in most cases, it's because of the appropriations budget, that they just get the funds, and the funds will tell them, we want you to do something for the Clean Water Act. We want clean water. And they say, well, we're trying to clean water. And I'll say, okay, specifically this system that you want built, how is that going to help you clean water? Well, I don't know. Well, why don't we ask the people that are going to use the system, or the citizens who are going to be the results of interacting with the system? Let's take all the people that are actually going to be the users of it and do user-centered design. And you'll see the line I have underneath there on the slide, which is user-centered design versus stakeholder-centered design. I dwell on this as being important because overwhelmingly what government does right now, and this is true at all levels, federal, state, local, is they do stakeholder-centered design. They focus in on who are the managers and the executives in government, and they determine what will be the value proposition that means success. So what they're saying is it's successful when it does X, Y, Z. And often in cases, what I find is those successes are very tactical, or things that don't have any real meaning, like it's successful when we increase people who come to the website. Well, why are they at the website? And the people at the website, are they frustrated? Are they happy? Are they getting to the end result that they wanted to? A good example here is State Department recently did a whole design thinking exercise around the passports and what they were going to do with passports. And for anybody who's gotten a passport in the past, I would say the program has improved significantly. I got a passport for my daughter relatively recently, but it's still a frustrating and why does it work this way process. And so they're rethinking it. And what they came up with is their value proposition. Their North Star that they're going to follow is no missed trips, right? And what's nice about that is it's absolutely from the citizen's perspective, because for the citizen coming in the door, for the most part, getting a passport is that they're probably going overseas, and it's probably a really important and awesome lifetime trip for that person. It could be just a regular business trip, but for a lot of people, it's a very special, experience. And that government was throwing all of these barriers in the way of people to get these things, that the people working with government felt like they had to jump through the hoops in order not to miss their trip. And now government's going to accept that responsibility. And I find that incredibly refreshing, that increasingly across government, we need to have that type of perspective. Is what does this mean for the citizen? What does this mean for the government worker? What does this mean for the people that are most interacting with this system, this tool, or this service? And how do we come up with the North Star? And the way you do that is using a design thinking practice, or user-centered design practices, or human-centered design practices. And the way to talk to executives and people in government about this, it's very difficult to say you need to do design thinking. They're going to go, that sounds like another buzzword. What's that going to do for me? Instead, ask them the question, what is the value proposition of their service, right? This is something any executive should be able to answer. And when they struggle to answer it, and most of them will, be ready for that, because they'll struggle, they'll identify something as maybe I should know that. And if they don't, they'll ask you, how do I determine that? Well, say, don't worry, there's a practice today called design thinking, and it helps you specifically do that. Let's get that vision. Where's the North Star? What does success look like? And then everything else underneath that will fall into place as there's a proper North Star that you can follow. So it's a really important point there, that design thinking is the way you determine your value proposition for ultimately the citizens. And sadly, it's not widely used in government. We see way more of it being done today than just 5 years ago. And you see a lot of efforts around customer service in government, which is also really thinking about this design thinking methodology and how we define our services. So I'm very encouraged by the direction everything's going in, but we need to see a lot more of it in order for us to follow the right directions. And I think that's the last slide. You want to keep the next slide? Oh, here are some resources. There's a U.S. Digital Services Playbook, which is wonderful. It gives you a great, easily read, short playbook on how to, it's not just, this is not good for just building out software. You can follow this in doing any program or any service. And then acquisitions, people always bring up to me, I have a background in that. People bring that up as a major blocker. If you're working with people in government and they say acquisitions won't allow me to do something, that's simply not the case. In 2010, OMB came out with modular contracting guidance. It was this guidance that if you've heard the word Agile acquisitions, is based off of. And so for 7 years now, the guidance out of OMB has been, whenever possible, please do modular contracting. And it's a wonderful resource to give to your acquisition professionals to say, you can help me buy in small increments, and you can help me buy at the speed of need once we've learned the best processes. And Vicki, the next slide, that we might be at the end here.
Yes, we're open for Q&A now. So I have a couple of questions. I was just actually texting with somebody, Greg, who said you hit the nail on the head when you said, when you were talking about the North Star and the fact that her manager thinks it's a buzzword and design thinking is a buzzword.
Right.
They don't even know the meaning of value proposition. So she's wondering if you could just go into a little bit more detail about when somebody's in that situation, because I'm sure she's not the only one. How do you begin to approach this with your managers? Because she's
So I'll tell you the moment.
They're not moving.
Yeah, I'll tell you the moment I had the big aha on this. It makes so much sense when you say it, and it's common sense, but it wasn't how I was thinking through most of my government experience. My aha came because I was hyper focused on Agile in government and having Agile teams deliver on that. And specifically, we were doing research and talking to and bringing out case studies of all these major failed projects in government. And what was interesting, on each of those projects, the teams at the bottom, the lowest level, the teams actually coding or delivering of the service and all that, they all knew they were going to fail. And this was true for healthcare.gov, which was in all the papers. But to be fair, every agency has their big failed project. It wasn't just HS it wasn't just CMS technically, but so in that scenario, what happened was, if you have your teams that know something's going to fail, but they kept trudging ahead. And so I kept talking about this cliff, that once we would do our acquisition up front with all the requirements, we were driving towards a cliff that we couldn't turn off on. And all the people in this car have this sort of depressing existence of looking at this cliff coming closer and closer and trying to figure out, well, we're not allowed to turn the car. We're not allowed to steer. So then I was pushing, like, we need to do Agile. These teams need to be able to turn the car and say, no, we need to go left. We need to go right. The problem was, even at that point in my argument, is then when you get to the next question of where are we going, the executives couldn't answer the question. And then I realized everyone's telling me this is an IT problem, but this is really, I say the business side, but it's really the mission side's problem. That if the executives on the mission side can't define value, right, there is no hope. Let's go ahead and do Agile, and we'll all be in the same car, and we're going to drive off the same cliff, right? The only difference will be we would have made a lot of beautiful and fun turns, right? But it's still going to fail. And that the deeper underlying problem, as you peel back that onion, is the mission side of government. It has their value proposition wrong. And it's really amazing how much easier all this becomes once that executive gets there. And so I've had these discussions with a lot of executives, and they all want to get there, but I don't start, and I never say the word design thinking up front. I avoid buzzwords and things like that. Instead, I ask them questions that they should know, and they get very uncomfortable, right? And it is in that uncomfortable state that if you're an executive and you're running a service out of government and you can't properly define for me its value, we got a problem here. Now, there will be some that will boldly define their value. And a great one I always give is, particularly like you talk to like an IT shop or a CIO's office or somebody, and we'll sit down and somebody will say to me, our strategy is we're a Microsoft house. That's our strategy. And now strategy isn't a vision, right? And I want to get the CIO's office to actually talk about vision when they tell me what they do, right? But you got to get them to look at, well, that strategy, that might be Microsoft's strategy, right, for you, but that's actually a tactic. You're using Microsoft tools to achieve something. What are you trying to achieve, right? And then they go blank, right? And you can kind of see why all the functions in government, I mean, I've worked in these functions. It's very difficult. You can't be successful as a function if you don't know what the purpose is that you're doing. And because particularly if something has IT with it, what I see is like often the mission sides will just throw the IT project over to the CIO's office and ask them to define value. And the value ends up becoming like, we're going to use a CMS, right? Because everyone's using a CMS. No, that's like the totally wrong discussion. It's how are you going to, in the case of EPA, how are you going to improve the environment? And so what I would say with the executives at the EPA is I'd say, look, I have an IT background. I'm not a biologist. You have to determine value. Now, I ended up standing up a small design thinking team inside, I was CTO, so it was inside my office, inside the CIO's office. So it was on the IT side. Now, the reason I set it up there was I was very familiar with design thinking and those practices, and I'm an entrepreneur and business owner, so I don't really think of the difference. To me, there's no difference between IT and the mission side. It's a silly, like we shouldn't be separating the two anymore. But here we are, there was a CIO's office and there was a business and mission side. And so because I had experience with it and people wanted to use the service, I was actually using 18F to help me stand up the service. And then we were hiring people in to do the service. Eventually people really liked it. And they said, Greg, we want to make that like a permanent service as part of the CIO's office or the CTO's office. And I said, I actually think it doesn't belong there. You should put it, in this case, you can put it anywhere, but I was saying this belongs in the deputy administrator's office. And they all looked at me and I said, because it is this practice that defines value, and frankly, biologists should be defining that, not IT. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So it's a good segue into another question that came in. When you were talking about the benefits of Agile over Waterfall, and the issue here for this person is that if they can't define requirements up front, their boss doesn't want to know. So
right.
How do you convince him Agile is the way to go?
Sure. So it's even worse, right? It's not only can they not, at the time of acquisitions, can they not define it, but when the budget was approved 3 years prior, someone assumed it was going to be a website, and they'll even put in that, build a website and all that stuff. We at EPA, we have a program that's called the SharePoint Center of Excellence. This was funded before anyone did any studies. Like they literally named the software the actual department. And in 20 years, are we going to be doing SharePoint? Will this department have any meaning? Because are we experts at SharePoint? Or are we experts at delivering whatever the goal was? So I think the key here is it's harder. I've been able to talk to people at the CFO's office and stuff about changing the way they fund things. They should fund outcomes, okay? So programs need to deliver on this outcome, okay? And then there should be plenty of flexibility underneath. What happens is that doesn't happen. So then it comes down and there's very specific tasks attached to the budget when no one actually did a design thinking workshop or is ready to contract in an agile way around an outcome. So you kind of have to reverse engineer it at that point. And what you say is, what I've said to people is, there is a general fear that most of these projects fail. In fact, it's as high as 94% either outright fail or fail to meet user expectations. Well, it's pretty guaranteed you're going to miss the user expectations if you only talked to them once 3 years ago. And truthfully, users don't even know exactly what they want. They got to experience the process with you. And that's what Agile does. It's a learning methodology. And so you get them to understand that, to get the managers and the executives to understand, you will fail. Statistically, you will fail. Your greater risk is waterfall and predicting these things up front. It's only if we allow to contract for work to go in that different direction. Now, they all say, well, how do I know I'm going to get the system I want, right? They panic. They feel comfortable with a contract that says to get the system that they don't want, right? So that what you do there is you basically bring them into the 3 phases, and you just talk about, there's some uncertainty here. Let's embrace that uncertainty. Let's figure out, pilot, do small things with small investments of those dollars, and do them quickly. In every case that I did a turnaround project on or started a project, so whether it was an intervention or just, embracing someone who was an early adopter, they all had the same phenomenon. People were freaking out until the first delivery. And usually that first delivery was anywhere between 4 weeks and 8 weeks. And up until that first 4 to 8 weeks, I explain to people, I sit down, I talk to them, and people are terrified because they just feel like, I don't know, I understand what you guys are building right now, but then all of a sudden they see how quick and responsive these things are. It's great. The only thing you want to prepare them for is that when they get that delivery in 4 to 8 weeks, it's not the final product. For the first time, these managers, everyone's being brought into how the sausage is made, how software development is done, and how you get through it. But you have to do it in small increments. So I talked about not going for the early low-hanging fruit. You do need an early win. Go after something with uncertainty, but go after something someone says is impossible. And when you deliver on that, they're fans. Like, once people have had a taste of it, they never go back. But there is an uncomfortable 2 months because it's not that it's risky, it's just uncomfortable. And unfortunately, people in government define uncomfortable as risky, and they have nothing to do with each other.
Right. So another question about, if we could go back to when you were talking about Denmark, and this person says they hit a wall every time I try to digitize our agency. I can't very well send a Jeff Bezos email. So how do you recommend somebody begin if that's the situation? They're trying to digitize their agency and they're just hitting that wall.
Yeah, so it has to come from the bottom and the top at the same time. I've not seen a top-down model work, so without having people at the bottom really behind it. But at the same time, it's very difficult to have a grassroots effort work when people at the top aren't supporting you. So depending on, it's almost like a maturity model. Depending on the maturity model, what I would do is if your agency is one that is really stuck in reverse and is way outdated compared to the others, in this situation, you want to start with just an Office of Innovation or a fellowship, like the Presidential Innovation Fellowship Program, like model a fellowship where you bring in entrepreneurial tech people to help just do little experiments to prove something can be done. Because it's all those executives in those agencies that are stuck in reverse, they just don't know what they don't know yet. So you need to do something small to dislodge them from that. I've had access to emails where people were tearing me apart in these early phases of trying things out, that I was crazy, didn't know what I was talking about, nothing could be done. And then when we did, those same people to my face were blown away, and they came in very genuine way. I am in shock that this was able to be done. I'm ready to listen now, right? So
right.
You need that small innovation group. If you're in a more mature agency that is starting to say that, first of all, innovation shouldn't happen just in a department, right? Like, if they're moving to a point where we want everyone to be innovative, there you need to have advocates in some key, go after early adopter programs, people who are like, want to deliver something better and faster. And the reason I say go after the early adopters, I spent a lot of time working on the interventions, and those interventions are done in programs that have a culture problem. It's not that the technology is hard, they have a culture problem. You have programs in your agency that are out forward thinkers, like embrace them, right? And then give them a high level advocate somewhere, hopefully at a CXO level, but at least a deputy CXO level, that is the person they can go to unblock things. And that's all you need to do. If you find the early adopter to deliver on the program and you tie them to some senior executive, it will work. And of course, the agency has to support them, but you got to look for those advocates. It's your
Right.
Bezos email won't work, right?
Yeah. And the last question I have for you, Greg, you've talked about strategy and tactics. We have to think strategically. We're in a dynamic environment. What advice do you give to government designers and creative leaders on strategizing their career in government design?
If you're in government, if you're in government and you're like, sometimes I've heard them described as customer service people or design people, but if you're in the field of design thinking, there's a whole lot of different titles and things underneath that. It could be user-centered design, human-centered design, it could be customer service, but if that's the field you're in, you're really in the right field. This is the future of government. There is, I used to say when I talked to executives, I was like, barbarians are at the gate, but they're not barbarians. They're the citizens. They're very unhappy with the services. Their expectation for digital services, that ship has sailed. People have productivity tools at home, and their kids are using them in elementary school that we don't have access to in government, right? So the pressure's there. There's no going back. We have to improve our delivery, and the citizen is really driving this pressure tremendously for the executives. And so you're in the right place, or if you can get into that field, you're in the right field. Now, you're going to be a pioneer in that field, okay? And so my recommendation in anyone who's a pioneer is you have to have a tough skin. You are going to take a lot of shots. People are going to say things that are completely ridiculous and not true, not based in fact at all. And you just have to be prepared with that, right? Talk about case studies, talk about examples, tell stories, get into delivery mode. Be like, the one thing I found is people in government, whenever I walk in and say, I'm willing to take the blame and I'm willing to do it, everyone gave me the work. It was incredible. I could get budgets, I could get all that stuff. So if you're willing to take that risk and you're willing to sort of stand by what you believe in, I think you're going to have an incredibly successful career. The other thing I would suggest is, you just personally, career-wise, you want to be unique and distinctive, right? You don't follow the herd on this. There's so many people in government that are following the herd, but that's not a really good career differentiator. What government needs and there's not a government, by the way, in the world. There's no government at any level that I've been talking to around the world that is talking about the need to sort of keep standardizing and make sure people deliver the same way. Everyone's under the same pain point and pressure. What's rare are the people that can come in and understand the importance of government and understand the importance of of understanding the value proposition. If you can help someone understand the value proposition of their service in government, you're incredibly valuable and you'll have an incredible career, but you're going to have to stand up for it and be willing to take the risk for it. I say risk, it's not really a risk. But to me, risk is continuing with the same habits that keep delivering failures. That to me is incredibly risky behavior.
Right.
Saying to someone you're going to do it differently and get a different result, that's like a guarantee, right?
I love it. Well, I'm all fired up. Well, Greg, it's been such a pleasure having you as our guest speaker today. Such a wealth of knowledge. One of our people who had to, participants who had to leave early said, thank you, Greg, for dropping some solid knowledge today. Thank you for your service. So I just echo that, Greg. It's been such a pleasure. And I don't know if we told people that you're actually joining us from the Comedy Fest up in Montreal. Did we tell them?
No, we didn't.
can get back to that now.
All right. Thank you, Vicky.
All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And you can find Greg here at cBrain F2, and his telephone number is here. He's more than willing to talk with anyone who wants to give him a call. And if you would like to talk to somebody from Aquent Federal, then this is the person you need to speak with. She's Vice President of Aquent Federal, Lee Andrews. Her phone number is 410-975-4183. And that brings us to the end. So I thank all of you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.